Hello, Josh. Could you please tell me who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Joshua Davila. I'm also known as the Blockchain Socialist on Yes, that's the name of my blog and podcasts that I've been running for about the past 5 years. I am also an author of the book Blockchain Radicals, which came out in August 2023. And I am the co-founder of Project Cooperative, where we build applications from what we call a post-capitalist lens. So we create applications from a very different, usually standpoint and framework, political and economic framework, compared to most standard DeFi projects. I'm able to kind of put into practice our beliefs and our ideology, however you want to phrase it. Um, and yeah, this is something kind of like a big project that I've been working on for many years now. And yeah, is I've done a lot of different things in order to try to grow and like make more visible the more progressive or left wing side of the crypto space.
Thanks for the intro. And I've listened to a lot of your podcasts. I've read your blog posts, and it is definitely like a refreshing narrative and voice. So we've talked about this before. I like this industry. I work in this industry full time, mostly in DeFi. It really heavily leans towards like a right libertarian mindset. And I don't necessarily engage with these ideas often. Maybe outside of DAOs, I think uh, DAOs have like a healthy mix of both. So, what led you down this path? Why are you specifically in crypto, and why are you in, I guess, this political education sphere?
Yeah, so my story is basically I was really broke in 2016, early 2017, around that time. And I started getting into crypto as a way to try and make some money quick. I thought potentially I was just doing kind of research. So it wasn't really like I didn't have much deal anyways. And, I was kind of working a job and then working Uber on the side in order to make extra money so I can actually pay off for the car that I needed to buy to get to my job. And I had known about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin wasn't really too interesting to me at first, since it sort of presented to me as just something. And so I started reading about Ethereum at the time, which was, a bit after the DAO hack, and was just like getting really interested in the idea of smart contracts and DAOs and kind of the political implication. I was already, before that conversation we had, Bernie Sanders was on the rise. And to me, that was like the first politician that ever in my life kind of, you know, we're talking about the political issues that I cared about in a way that I agreed with. And so I had been, as Donald Trump was, when he was the first time elected, I was also in these various kind of left wing groups, and they mainly involved just kind of like reading theory. And so to me, there was this like very obvious connection between smart contracts, DAOs, and left wing economic history that I could not find like anyone talking about. And I was like really frustrated with that. And for, about a year or two, after a year or two of kind of like getting like really obsessed and really into the Ethereum space at the time, I was like learning Solidity. I was doing all these very early, there were like no real applications at the time. It was just kind of like something you held and played around with. Very little. Like there were ICOs, I guess, but there was not much else. And so, yeah, just kind of like went down kind of research and trying to understand things and still waiting for someone to begin to make the connections. Like I was making the connections, but still no one was really coming. And so in 2019, I finally decided that, fuck it, why don't I do it? So I made this account of the Blockchain Socialist. It was anonymous on Twitter. I made some online communities on Discord and Reddit called Crypto Leftists, and then just started what was first just a blog. So just like every week, publish an idea for a blog. I'd publish it. It was kind of like, the first time anyone was ever trying to make, maybe not the first time, but the first time anyone was consistently making these type of connections, I felt. And then eventually moved more towards podcasts, since those are easier to make every week. and started a Patreon. So people, and then eventually, after a couple of years of putting out content like that, I was asked if I wanted to write a book. And so I wrote a book. It took about a year and a half, and that came out in 2023. It's kind of putting from zero to one, the framework for what I would consider like the a way for the left to kind of view crypto, and a framework to understand it, both for people who haven't even touched any of it, and for people who are already in a different framework. And so, yeah, and then now I also kind of a lot of my time now, besides the podcast and everything, is on basically building out Breadchain Cooperative, where we have built some applications, and we have a token that is basically a wrapped stablecoin that helps fund various projects that we consider post-capitalist, without you necessarily losing any money or making any donation. So that's kind of like the quick version of it.
So, a question that comes to mind is, why do you feel there are a lot of people that are in that, right, libertarian leaning world in crypto? Because I feel like a lot of the things that crypto does, as you say, like DAO specifically, kind of resemble European, what were they called? S- uh, Syndicates, co-ops, like from yeah, they resemble a lot of structures that I think do really well with socialism. So own property of your work, an easier way to get paid, less middlemen, um, a more free system, I would have to say, because I use this. I'm basically my entire life is in this. I don't have any like regular. I do have bank accounts, but all my money's stored in crypto. All like I have DAO memberships. I contribute to a lot of different things, and I feel like that's a much better way of dealing with work than what we have out there. So in the past, I used to work as a salesperson for a giant corporation, and like that top-down hierarchy, it does well in like making money, maybe organizing, getting things done. But I never felt like there was a way for me to get out of the rut that I was in. And within crypto, I feel like the rut, like is very quick. Like as long as you do things, you're actually going to very quickly rise up to the top. And everyone that does anything kind of gets a form of compensation for it. But to go back to my question, why do you feel like this hasn't attracted many left leaning people as of now?
Yeah. So, um, I think the truth is you have to look at the history of the cryptocurrency space, which was very heavily influenced by the right libertarian kind of movement, or people who did consider themselves rights libertarians. I can necessarily like call themselves that, but I would say they kind of effectively were. I think many of them do. Like they would say that they're libertarian, and they do follow this kind of like Austrian economics um, frame of mind. And I kind of I get what you're saying in that. I think what kind of tends to happen is people invent something, maybe with a particular idea in mind of what it will do and what it is useful for. But then once you let it out into the world, it's kind of anybody can take it. Anyone can sort of like push it to its extremes and make it totally beyond what they thought it would have been or what it would become. That fits a completely different political framework, because they don't really because they didn't think in that political framework, they would not have thought about their new invention as something as being able to. And a lot of the early inventors or early people who were influential in the creation of Bitcoin were libertarian and were, on the right side of the libertarian spectrum. Not everyone, but a lot of them. And he's like, I mean, he is very right wing. That is like, if you just look at a few of his tweets that are not just about cryptography, you will know. Um, and so, you see that in the actual implementation of Bitcoin. The 1 million cap of Bitcoin comes from an already existing, gold bug movement in the United States, where they thought the problem with our monetary system is that the government can print whatever it wants and it prints too much. And while I mean, I'm definitely sympathetic to certain aspects of that argument. I think what is missing um, is kind of like what they chose as the answer to that, as being something that is potentially worse than what we have now in some ways. Of course, it really depends, but is not a good answer, I would say. Having a money bitcoins can be created doesn't really fix the monetary issue. And is actually what it does is it creates actually even more like an even worse hierarchical system that is rather than based on just like government or not government, which is, their place, but is actually a system of people who are creditors versus debtors. The if we were to live in our fully maximalist Bitcoin world, then people who take on debt are basically completely screwed and will forever be an indentured servant, probably, unless they do and are able to make back the amount that they borrowed. The reason being that when you have a type of currency that is deflationary, then it completely prevents any ability or any desire for people to take on debt. And that may sound like for a core libertarian, like someone who's into Ayn Rand, they're like, oh, this is a good thing, right? That taking on debt is anyway super bad. Nobody should be doing it. So this is the right way to go. But in reality, like, credit and debt has been like historically extremely important for allowing people a space to take on risk. And so if you're in this giant economy where the money system is deflating, everything is getting more expensive very quickly, um, or money itself is getting very expensive. And so therefore things generally are getting more expensive, even though it's not inflation, it's deflation. And it only favors the people who already have money. So, these types of things were not really questioned in the creation of Bitcoin. This was considered just like, this is a good thing. Uh, um, I think, in my view, Bitcoiners are kind of like very hard set on like the very rigid protocol of Bitcoin and how it exists and not updating it very much, if at all. I do think that probably Satoshi was not as rigid as like kind of maybe the current crop of like Bitcoiners, but that is kind of like the reality. And so I think, generally the issue is you can see that right-wing libertarian like economic thought is super influential in the creation of the protocols themselves. Although we want to say, the technology is neutral and whatever else, to a certain extent, who uses it, but it's not so neutral when it comes to the ideology which is underlying the protocol. So yeah, I think that's kind of the reason. Before crypto even existed, if to go even deeper, I mean, this question of like money on the internet was only a question that largely people who are on the libertarian side of the political spectrum were interested in pursuing and doing. There was the cypherpunks were also heavily influenced. The cypherpunks, I think, are more complicated. There's not like, I wouldn't say that all libertarian, but a lot of them were. And I think probably the more libertarian minded side of the cypherpunks were those interested in this question of like money on the internet, while maybe the more like left wing side of the cypherpunks were less interested in that question. So yeah, those are. I mean, there's like a few different reasons why I think there's a really good book called Digital Cash by Finn Brunton. If you're interested in the kind of like political history of cryptocurrency that goes back to like the 1920s or earlier, I recommend taking a look if you want.
That's a very comprehensive answer, and I think I agree with you on a lot. I have to like warn that I'm not necessarily very educated on like political theory. I do like I kind of live in my own bubble or world. I have two questions, and then want to get into Breadchain Cooperative and try to understand how that works and what you're trying to do to change, at least, or to create an alternative path to the world of DeFi and crypto products. One of them is the question I asked you when we met, and I ask it from a very, I would say, legitimate or sources. I've I feel like I'm a libertarian type person. I loved the sovereign individual. I love um I just like freedom, or the sense, like the idea of what freedom means to a lot of libertarian people. But I also think we need to live in a world that is built on a sort of socialist financial system, because like increasingly as we move forward, technology is going to be replacing a lot of people. And you know, it's going to be very hard for the majority of people to live without either being indentured servants, or without us changing our economic system. So I always fall back in this libertarian socialist world where, you know, you are free to do whatever you want and there is no government, but somehow we need a way to all cooperate and build out the things that a government would typically provide, that schools, hospitals, healthcare, and all the things that, you know, we tend to see in socialist European countries, like where I lived in Poland, just without the, I would say, the force of the government, or the I would say it because it is what's difficult for me is taking in, let's say, a government that wants to give me free healthcare, but also wants to take my money to bomb other people. Like I can't reconcile these two, and so I feel like I'm pushed into a direction where I don't think there's any representation at all. So that question is going to be like, do you think that the idea of libertarian socialism is applicable? It can work within the crypto sphere?
Yeah, and I mean, those are good questions. I can totally understand and totally sympathize with what you're saying and what you mean. I mean, I also live, I grew up in the U.S., but I now live in Europe, and definitely, I mean, I would say that like there is no like socialist European country. I would say, for the most part, there's definitely, I would say, Europe has much more of a history of social democracy, which was kind of like the compromise in post World War II between the liberals and the socialists in many countries to um, keep capitalism, but to provide a a healthy welfare.
The last thing I heard specifically was about Europe having a history of social democracy, as a, yeah, to reconcile, like, I guess the liberals and or yeah, the liberals and the socialists.
But anyways, I think kind of maybe to move towards more of the crypto side of that question, I do think that there are basically ways with the use of crypto that we can kind of create what I would frame as like islands of socialism within a sea of capitalism, if that makes sense. And this is, these are the kinds of structures that have existed for a long time, like, worker cooperatives, like syndicates, as you mentioned before, um, anarcho-syndicalism as like, has a rich history in Spain. And I actually wrote a piece about this that I can share with you maybe later on my Mirror a couple of years ago, called DAOs, Anarcho-Syndicalism in a Digital World. Um, and so I think the DAO space is definitely one where you'll find much more people who are interested in, let's say, you'll find people in both, right? Both pro market and non market forms of governance. And I think um, what by and large, like I'm interested in is trying to toe the line of like, you know, non market forms of governance that are able to account for people's preferences without like trying to, you know, appeal to the very wealthy, which is often the case in some DAOs. It kind of, of course, it depends. There's a lot of variety in DAOs, um, and more so, like, and also, I guess, being able to toe the line between that and like having money, and just because that's like kind of a necessary thing that we all kind of have to do living in the world today. And so, like, towing that line, that sweet spot between like getting capital in while not being dominated by capital, I think those are where you'll find the kind of islands of socialism, or kind of what I would call post-capitalism, as in, organizations and institutions that are trying to move beyond a logic of just profit maximization, as that's kind of like the norm in a lot of DeFi world. So trying to move beyond that. So I think it is possible. It just requires it requires effort. It requires like critical thinking about how do we design these systems? Because crypto is ultimately I think what it's best at is being a technology for the scaffolding of new institutions. And so but at the same time, there are a lot of embedded kind of capitalistic economic structures within most protocols that it is difficult to avoid, and just it's kind of like a contradiction that you have to endure, and a contradiction you have to like keep in mind, and not necessarily think that you can completely overcome every single contradiction, because that's kind of impossible.
So this kind of really leads into the last question I have before we can jump into Breadchain. Um, I've been in a lot of DAOs, and I would consider myself somebody that's like pretty economics. I work a lot. Like I just go and I work pretty much all day, and I try to make as much money as possible. And what I've seen within DAOs is you'll have like a setup where there's a treasury. That treasury, let's say, it has $100,000, and then you have maybe 4 or 5 people that are growing that treasury, and then you have the voting class, which would be the remainder of the community. These are people that jump into community calls, or like they write blog posts. They do a lot of things that don't necessarily bring in capital, but keep the system like feeling lively. So like if a new person jumps into this Discord server, as an example, they see activity, they see people chatting, they see people having fun. It's not just about, like, let's say, a corporation where it's like work, 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 and then social life is done elsewhere. And I've personally felt this like tug and pull between these two different classes, or types of people, where I typically am one of the people that's going out trying to get grants, trying to get work, trying to get money, and then I bring that into the treasury, and then people vote on how that treasury is spent. Obviously, I'm not alone. I'm never the main person here. I'm just one of the workers, let's say. And there's like a frustration that's felt on both sides, where the people that are bringing in money typically have a higher voting power. The people that don't have a lower voter power. They want to spend money on less things that bring in capital, and more so on, things that make everybody happy, and give everybody like a sense of equal opportunity in the space. And that tug and pull is exhausting, because what do you prioritize? Like, because if you let, let's say, the socialist class spend all the money that's been accumulated during the capitalist phase, uh, then that kind of structure falls apart. At least this is what I'm thinking. I'm talking about like my thought process and trying to work through that. Then the capital kind of disappears, and we have to go back into a phase of like hyper capitalism, where people have to rebuild that wealth. And then there's a transition phase where people have had enough of this and they need to spend it again. And I've found it really hard to like work within DAOs, or to be, the optimal type of person that I should be within that. Do you have any idea of like how can these two different classes work together?
I mean, yeah, that is it's interesting because I know a good German writer who wrote a lot about this in class and kind of the contradictions of class. Um, and so, like, I think it's unsurprising that there are these frustrations or conflicts, and that's because, like, depending on your position within the organization, like, you have different socioeconomic desires. Because of that class position. And this is not saying that means that you guys are always diametrically opposed. Of course, you have like the shared purpose of that organization, but the difference becomes more and more striking depending on like how much a particular person owns of that organization, assuming that the organization is like a for-profit entity, and how much maybe the workers own of that organization, if they do own anything. So I think there is, like, for me, you get out of this contradiction. Um, well, not only you get out of it, but you kind of alleviate the contradiction a bit more if there is more, let's say, if there's less of a gap between the people who own the organization and people who do not. And so, historically, this has been done through like either labor unions being created and giving people who work in the organization some amount of power in being able to negotiate with those who own it. And then, as well, another way, every worker in the organization has a vote. So votes are not distributed based on someone's acquisition of capital or their ownership of capital, but instead by their ability to engage in the organization. So I mean, I can I can say at least for, we'll talk about Breadchain in a bit, but Breadchain itself, we organize it as a cooperative and everybody has a say. It's one member, one vote. Of course, we're not as like, and I'm talking specifically about the core team and as well at the upper level of the project leads, which I can explain a bit later. But one person, one vote. And what I have found is that in these types of organizations, it gives a lot more. It it it, it puts everyone at like a more equal playing field of understanding, if that makes sense. Like, um, someone who normally, if they were just a worker, they didn't own any part of the organization, they only came and they collected their check and then they left. They have like zero incentive to try and continue to bring in work or to bring in money or however it is. But I found that at least in our group, where everyone is sort of on the same page, everyone has an equal amount of ownership and say, there's a lot more, um, I guess, like desire to take on other bits of work that they otherwise wouldn't have done, or like to expand. Kind of like they know that it's not just a wage that they come and collect, but is something that they also contribute to and is a part of its creation and its development. And so, like a lot of people on the team have, without like me kind of doing anything, have brought up all these grant opportunities that we had and that we've applied for and even won. They have brought forth like potential client work. So I find that if you can, change the class structure of the organization from the get go, then you can avoid a lot of these complications. It doesn't completely remove all, conflicts because people can just simply have different opinions about things, but it definitely alleviates the like, I think, a big chunk of the issue. And another aspect I think that is important to keep in mind is that, DAOs have almost like this implied, um, like horizontality to them for a lot of people. Like when you think of decentralization, a lot of people come in and they think like horizontal. But that's not necessarily the case in a lot of them, and so I think there becomes this like disappointment that that isn't actually the case because they didn't really think about those who own all the tokens, governance tokens, for example, versus those who are like working separate classes and having different um just like different things that influence them. And so there's also, if you try to make a more horizontal structure, there's also a need to like know how to work in that way, right? Because for 99% of us, probably, we have only worked in very vertical or very like hierarchical organizations, like in a corporate structure. Like I've worked plenty of corporate jobs, you know, before actually like beginning to try and put into practice, horizontality or like, you know, having equal ownership and governance through a worker cooperative, for example, you don't realize that the way that you work is very different in both settings, in a, kind of a more vertical versus a more horizontal. And I'm not saying that like everyone should work in a horizontal way and that should be how you organize everything, because that's definitely not the case in Breadchain all the time. But that by decreasing that verticality, I guess, um, you begin to realize that like I'm not just like picking up my wage, or like I'm not just like going clocking in, getting a wage, and then see you later. But I am also like a part of that organization, and I have the ability to influence it, and that gives like people a lot more independence. It gives them more freedom, and it gives them the ability to really influence in ways that they would like to. So that's kind of my advice, is to look into, you know, really understanding the structure of your organization.
That makes a lot. There's a lot of really good advice there, like having a shorter vertical and a wider base is definitely the way to go, and I think a really good example of this done in the real world is, worker unions, because at the end of the day, if the worker union doesn't actually play ball, I guess, with the capitalist class, eventually the money is going to stop flowing. So there needs to be this like equal footing where they get a say, but they also need to understand that by participating, they are able to feed their families, feed their friends, pay for all of their health cares, et cetera, et cetera. By having like a very long vertical, I think people are really disincentivized from trying, and feel like there's no point in actually playing this game. Uh, putting it into practice is very difficult though. I've tried. I'm a software engineer. I had like a small co-op of software engineers. So this was my experiment about almost 3 years ago. I had to shut it down when my son was born because I was the one that was getting the clients, and everyone else was doing the development. And I felt this like insane pressure because if I stopped working, if I got sick, if my kid needed me, these people don't get income. So I needed to eventually dissolve that. But it was set up as like a, I would say it was a triangle, but with like a very, very wide base and a very short top. And it helped. I felt like everybody there was a lot happier. I was a lot happier. I didn't feel like this smug superiority that I do sometimes when I'm working in the vertical. Yeah, I think it's just a way of like, how do you look at people? The bigger the vertical, the worse way you interact with or see other humans. Like it's either, a boss or an underling, and I don't feel like that's healthy for us. But let's jump into Breadchain and Breadchain Co-op and talk about like your experiment with this and how that's going, and tell me a bit about how this organization is structured.
Yeah, sure. So Breadchain Cooperative, you can go to the website breadchain.xyz. Essentially is kind of my and others' attempts at trying to answer the question of like, how does the left interact with the crypto space? So, you know, before we kind of existed, there was no like explicitly, in my view, like left wing project in the crypto space. There were like definitely projects with good intentions in like, donations or, public goods funding, and not trying to knock those or anything like that. But I don't think that they were like, they didn't come in mind with like a specific ideological kind of agenda. And although like many DeFi projects don't necessarily say that like they're right wing or something like that, I think a lot of them end up definitely perpetrating, a right wing ideological agenda and like frame of mind around economics and around kind of like the world, a kind of like dog eat dog like world that I don't personally agree with or like want to take part in or want to necessarily help keep develop in that way. And so we kind of, me and a few others in the crypto leftist community, many of them who were developers in the crypto space, how do we go about this? Because probably the crypto space is going to keep growing, whether or not people like it. And there needs to be like a proper response, and they become more important, more politically important. And the technology does have like very legitimate use cases from not just like, a left wing political point of view, but from like many political points of view. But also the left. And we saw this, with WikiLeaks, we saw this with Sci-Hub, like more kind of like what you could arguably call, progressive or left-wing kind of groups and organizations have used cryptocurrency very successfully in the cases of like financial blockades. And so we were like, all right, um, how do we, for example, kind of the main question we were trying to solve is how do we get around this issue of funding for a lot of these organizations that normally depend on like donations, or they depend on like, people sacrificing quite a lot in order to make that money, in order to like, I mean, really not even to make that money. I mean, really to like get enough money to do like very, very basic things is like a forever struggle if you've been involved in like left wing organizations. And so what we did is we created a system that's kind of a mix of a local currency and a credit union. And so uh, we built everything on Gnosis Chain. And basically, it's a smart contract where you give XDAI. So XDAI is a US dollar pegged stablecoin. It's the native currency of Gnosis Chain. And then when you give it, you get right back one-to-one bread tokens. So if I give like 10 XDAI, I get 10 bread tokens. And what goes on in the background is all that XDAI that I've given gets converted into SDAI, or the DAI savings rate on Gnosis Chain. So it's earning a yield percentage. I think right now is like 13.5%. So it's fairly high at the moment, which is nice. And you, with your bread tokens, you can always burn it to receive back the X die that you gave. And 10 bread, I get 10 X die back. But as that, as long as I hold the bread, I am allowing for the Breadchain cooperative network to earn yield on SDAI. And then every month, all of the yield that's been accumulated over that month gets distributed to the projects within the network based on a vote. And so the more bread that I hold, the more votes that I have. The vote, though, is something that, or the voting power that you get is only useful for the next voting cycle. So if I give bread now, all the bread that I hold for the previous 30 days, I then get voting power for the next voting cycle. And I can vote on kind of like by putting points, I can make a ratio for how I would like my voting power to be attributed to each project and to influence the distribution. And so if I give like 1 point to every project, then I give an equal distribution. I can add a couple more points to particular projects that I like more, like the Breadchain core team, for example, is a team that I lead, which handles all the development stuff. And then the distribution happens automatically using PowerPool, if people know that protocol. But do smart contract automation, we do this every 30 days. It's kind of like it's a set it and it's going to go on forever as long as we don't touch it. Although we do like updates every once in a while, of course. But then the distribution, just to add, is done 50% based on the vote and then 50% based on an equal distribution. So every project will always get some amount of bread in the distribution, but who are voting, who are bread holders. And so what we call this whole kind of system is a solidarity primitive. So what we're doing is we're taking, the idea of financial primitives in DeFi, like the Lego building blocks that we put together in order to create, more complex or advanced financial products. But rather than solely focusing on a relationship of finance, or like a relationship of like buyer, seller, speculator, someone wins, therefore someone else must lose. In our system, our primitives are based on solidarity. So here in this system, like nobody is losing money. We're earning a yield on SDAI. So we're kind of like acting as parasites to one part of the DeFi ecosystem, sucking some of it out and averting it or diverting it towards post-capitalist ends. And so the point of this is to raise money without people losing any money, without people having to give like donations, and therefore being able to help fund what we hope will become the new institutions of like a post-capitalist, what is able to help build that post-capitalist economics.
So I have a really quick question, and I think this is on the technical or economic side. So when let's say I put in like 1,000 X die per year, I'm losing on that like a percentage. Do you try to, so because I know that S die gets around 10%, give or take, maybe between 5 and 10%. Inflation is around like 2.5. Do you try to make the investor, or like whoever's parking the money in this, do you try to give them that inflation yield, or do you simply distribute all of the interest to the are you giving all the interest to the projects on Breadchain?
So right now we're giving all the yields to the projects on Breadchain. The way that if you wanted to make money, you can, is by providing liquidity on Curve. So that's the main decentralized exchange that we use for bread. So the idea is that, right, we need to, ideally, we don't want people to burn their bread, right? If in case you are holding bread and you need to like change your position for whatever reason, the ideal situation is that you would be able to swap it for whatever the asset is that you want, rather than burning bread and then, swapping the X die. And so what you can do is you can provide liquidity on the exchange, and there you would be able to make money off of people making those swaps. We're also working on an integration with Gnosis Pay. So the idea is that we want people to be able to spend their bread. So we want to make it as easy as possible for people to simply hold bread in their wallets, set up a kind of like automatic swap where whenever their wallet goes, beneath a certain number or level, the bread gets automatically converted into euros, and you're using the Curve decentralized exchange liquidity pool, and people who are providing liquidity can earn interest on that. But holding bread itself, right now we just have all of the yield goes to the projects.
I really think that's like a very beautiful idea, and I think it could work in practice. And I don't want to meddle, but I think you can convince a lot more people to park their money in there if you give them back that info. Because I'm saying this not necessarily because I personally care, but because I always get this as a response from people, which is, we don't want the inflation to eat up our funds. So uh, that's a conversation worth having. Have you spoken to Protocol Guild or Octant by any chance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very good friends with Trent from Protocol Guild, so we've talked quite a bit about it. Like I think he would also say that Protocol Guild is a kind of solidarity primitive.
Mhm.
Spoke a little bit to Octant, but nothing really came out of it. I think yeah, maybe they see their protocol as almost like competing in a certain way. Although I don't see it that way at all. Um, so yeah, I mean, we've had conversations for sure.
It reminds me a lot of their system. I think this system makes a lot of sense where you're not giving out the core asset, you're giving out that interest that's being earned.
Mhm.
And I think that's very helpful because a lot of people, they don't. Yeah, it's hard to say because let's say I want to donate a certain amount per year. It feels unstable, and in a sense, like if I give away like a good chunk of money to something that they can actually do something meaningful with, and then I'm kind of like, let's say a year later, my car breaks down, my kid gets sick, whatever, and I'm in a stuck situation. I think a lot of people are disincentivized from investing in I guess social goods or like things that don't necessarily earn any interest or grow. But I love this, and then I personally, I think that's necessary. So I like again, I live in Europe, and I came from the United States. I also spent about 7 years in Algeria, North Africa, and countries in North Africa. I would say in the Arabic world in general don't work with interest. I think it's the term is haram. It's not allowed in the religion to lend or loan for interest. So they have like very interesting mechanisms that I don't see being used at all in the West. One of them is called IOU notes. This is something that was built in Turkey. So I could basically give you an IOU to take something from you, and then you're basically staking on my reputation, saying that this person isn't going to burn me. And these IOUs get traded like around the economy. So the money isn't growing, but it's moving around in a very efficient way. Um, and in places like places like Algeria and let's say Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of oil, so they sell this oil and then they take that money that they use and they just give people free houses. But you have this really, I guess, toxic situation that ends up happening. We'll take Dubai as an example, where you have this overclass of the people that are living off of the economy, like the
Yeah.
government's economy, and then you have the slave labor, which is people from Southeast Asia that are coming to build the state, and they don't get any money, they don't get any of the benefits because the asset itself is a limited thing. So if the government were able to like earn interest on their oil in a way that could be interesting. Have you tried to take this system and spread it over different like protocols or white label it? Is that in your plan?
Mm. Yeah, good question. It is. So right now, one of the grants that we've received was from the like our Optimism Builders grant. So we're working on a project that we call the Optimism Builders Dollar, which is essentially, it's very similar to the bread system that I explained earlier, except meant for funding public goods builders in optimism. And so basically, I think we haven't yet fully confirmed which stablecoin asset we'll use in the system. We're still kind of just doing a bit of research to see which stablecoin can give us the best yield. Um, but basically, the yield that would be accumulated from that would be going towards those who have qualified for a builder's grant themselves. So the assumption is that they're building public goods for the Optimism ecosystem. And right now, the way that Optimism works is that when you are uh, granted or given a grant, or you're not given the money immediately, you have to wait a year after they say they approve your grant. You wait a year, they check to see that you've actually built the thing, and then they give you the money. So what that does is that creates a kind of difficult situation for certain people if they don't have the financial means uh to like survive for a year to then build the actual thing that they said that they were going to build. Then it can be really difficult. And so what we're trying to do is create a system where we can provide some financial relief to those people as they're building the thing that they're not getting money for a whole year, so that they can actually, what we believe is that that's going to like improve the quality of the public goods that are being built and give people much more flexibility and freedom in being able to build that while they have not received any of that grant money. So that's one of the things.
Giveth and Polygon are collaborating on a very small scale experiment, which operates in a similar way. So instead of giving them the like POL or Matic or whatever, they will put it, like lock it, give them the yield, and then they can spend the yield for a year. And they'll do that with 5 different projects, and they'll lock up a lot of pull, so it actually makes sense. Like the interest is enough to pay people what they would need in order to do development work for a year. And so there is like I think there's like a little bit of interest now that I guess crypto is growing to a size where I think maybe most of the people in crypto can survive just off of interest. Like we don't necessarily need to sell tokens within the next 5 years. We could just lock them up, loan them, do all the schemes that we've been doing, and a lot of people could survive on the interest. Maybe not everyone, but it's nice that there's a growing interest in this. um, I had a question. I think it slipped my mind. But okay. So how do people decide on what's going to happen in the Breadchain co-op?
So right now, the main way that like we let the public decide anything is through the vote. So if you go to like app.breadchain.xyz, which is where the app is, and you go down in the menu for like, the first page you'll see is like for baking bread, and then there's another page on governance where you can vote. There you can see where you're able to influence it. So it's mainly just on the distribution of the funds. So that is something we've like intentionally kind of scoped out governance rather than making it a kind of like free for all, like big proposal system, which we're not necessarily like against for the public to make proposals or anything. But the governance part, we've kind of like created like an intentionally scoped form of governance where people can influence intentionally, and then that's kind of like the main thing, that like it's permissionless, like what you're able to do there, which by making it scoped, we're able to kind of like reduce our attack surface, like for hackers or for people who are bad actors or whatever else. We keep that small for the most part. But we do have a server. So the crypto leftist Discord server is where a lot of our public discussions take place. So people can, they can come into the server and make proposals there. And that's kind of done more at a qualitative level. We have an internal kind of part of the core team where we make proposals in a form, and then we kind of like discuss there. That's largely scoped to the core team, which is about like 11, 12 people, something like that. And so what we're trying to do is not like scale too fast, because we have limited resources. We're not trying to promise on things. So for the most part, it's like within the core team, we have this, horizontal structure where people can provide proposals or make requests and changes. We have a pretty open, like the team is not, it's not like it's like super difficult to join or to like have discussions with us. We have weekly community calls. We try to stay like very available. So if you are someone from the outside, you can still make proposals. You can definitely suggest things. It's not too bad. to do that, I think. And you can make proposals in the Discord server, and we've definitely taken advice and suggestions from people. But yeah, that's kind of like the structure at the moment. We also there's like also the higher level that I mentioned previously, which is the project leads. So every project within the network has a project lead, and then we have a separate group where we handle kind of like higher level strategic things or kind of network effect type of stuff. But that's kind of the structure at the moment. And I think as we grow, the like things will begin to evolve and change, right? Like the bread chain today is not going to look like the bread chain of like where we have $1 billion in TVL or something like that. Inshallah, we make it to that point.
Inshallah. One last question about this topic. So you're basically Breadchain Co-op is exploring uncharted territory and working with a sort of handicap, I would say. Like you're not participating in the like worst version of the market, which is also the most profitable. Do you so just as a question, do you have any fears around like what's going to happen in the next few years? Is there anything that makes you feel anxious about, the direction
Yeah,
that
for
you're
sure. I
going?
mean, of course, this is like, yeah, I think we're going into uncharted territory. Very exciting about it, right? And why I think a lot of people find it refreshing and why they want to take part in it. Because I do think that even people who are like taking part in a lot of DeFi and like doing degen things, like I think for a lot of people they're not doing it because they like are necessarily addicted to gambling or like that that's necessarily the world that they want to live in, but is the world that they feel like they are forced into. So providing the opportunity where we can say, we can't, being realistic, like, right, we're not going to change the entire structure of the world in like, a couple of days or something like that with like a single application, but we can offer you an opportunity to be a part of the creation of what I think are like the edges of history and the creation of new institutions to then begin to create the foundations for creating something different so that you don't have to be like you don't feel like you have to be you know uh, a degen putting all your money in this or that in order to like make money enough so that you feel like you feel safe and can retire. um so I think that there's definitely a fear for me, like maybe there isn't enough people who really care and who don't want to build new institutions, who don't want to see who like are okay with the way that things are working. That could be the case, right? It could be that people simply don't care and they simply want like they're bought into our like Mad Max, degen future. Um, but I do think that at least for me, when I talk to people, at least I don't know if maybe because they're talking to me, they change their tone. It does seem that a lot of people would like alternatives. They just don't know where they are and they don't see them. Um,
I read recently, I went to a library and I saw a summary of Karl Marx's book about like the economy. And one thing that I think he was really great at, like looking at the world and seeing it how it is and describing the issues that exist within it. I think the issue is that the way that you sell that change or the idea of like how can we go and get out of this is really the key here, because I feel like what you're saying. I have had like a gambling addiction. I've spent like way too much money last year throwing money into meme coins, literally casinos, and anything, because I feel afraid that in the future, I'm not going to be able to give my son what he needs or give myself what I need. Some people, I've spoken to people when I was working in like traditional corporate world. I've spoken to more than one person that said they don't plan to retire. They're just going to kill themselves when they're at that age. They don't like, and they say this with a straight face, because and what they're saying is actually true. It is scary. It's terrifying. We don't have social safety nets. So I think the problem that a lot of people are going to run into, and the reason they kind of flip the other way, is they don't buy the solution to the problem of like we're going to eradicate the institutions, we're going to give everybody equal opportunity and or equal outcome, and also the government, like specifically in the United States, has like thoroughly brainwashed people into thinking that anything that has a social undertone is bad or communism and should be abolished. So you have your work ahead of you, and I know that there are a lot of people that feel the way you do. They just you just kind of need to convince them that there is a solution that is realistic. And I admire that. I think you're doing great work.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, and it's something that I won't be able to do alone. It's definitely a team game, and so I really hope that people, who are listening and resonate with this, are open to, joining the crypto leftist community and like taking part in discussion and providing their feedback, putting in some money into bread if they want to. So I hope they do, and like helping make this a reality so that we can, inch our way towards something different and something better, and in a realistic way is what I think. In a way that doesn't require you to like give up to make a huge donation, um, in order for it to be even remotely viable, but is something that, we're trying to take the principles of like basic personal finance, of just kind of like compounding interest, uh, and playing the long term game. And that if we can compound interest for long enough and get enough people without in, you know, a bit into the system, and maybe hopefully one day someone puts in a lot of money, then we can like create something that is like really a different institution, really something that can make a difference. So I hope people who are listening,
One more group to shout out is Opolis. I think Opolis has like a very compatible, I guess, problem with what you're trying to do. So that's again insurance for people that are working in crypto that don't work for a company and aren't able to get it from their employer. So that's health, the same problems in the U.S. health insurance issues, life insurance, all of that. They offer ways to do that. Like they have like the legal rails, but I think they're doing a really not great job at like convincing people to join for various reasons. I think there's a compatibility there. So I'm going to link all of like I'm going to link your podcast, your blog, your website, the Breadchain Cooperative, in the description. And then I'm going to tell some people that I know would be very interested in what you guys are doing. And hopefully, yeah. So hopefully I'll talk to you again in a few years when things are and see how things change. I think they're going to change for the better.
yeah, for sure. Thank you. I just gave you some of the links in the chat. If you want to share those, I added the Mirror blog where I talk about anarcho syndicalism and DAOs, and the various websites, for my blog and podcast, for the book, and for Breadchain. So yeah,
Will do, Josh.
hope those are helpful for people, and yeah, looking forward to telling you in a year what our progress is.
Thank you for taking the time, and I'm excited to talk in a year.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And yeah, see you in the next one.